This is the third in a three-part series called Understanding Palestine. Today, we're going to be discussing possible paths to liberation for Palestinians who continue to exist and to resist under the brutal occupation of their homelands by the settler state of Israel, or in the diaspora forced to flee their homelands by the ongoing Nakba, deprived of their right of return. We, of course, hold this conversation in the midst of a genocidal siege on Gaza by the Israeli military, in which at least roughly 35,000 Palestinians have been murdered, including nearly 15,000 children, more than 77,000 injured and debilitated, and around 1.7 million people displaced. There are 8,000 people missing, and these are the numbers from Al Jazeera. As has been reported widely, whole family lineages have been annihilated. Multiple international bodies and human rights watch groups have warned that this is at the very least likely a genocide. We hold this conversation also during the ongoing repression of resistance by Palestinians and their supporters by both Israel and Zionist institutions in the US and elsewhere, repressing even the ability to call it what it is, a genocide by a Zionist settler colonial state that has been engaged in a project of dispossessing, murdering, and subjugating the indigenous Palestinian population at least since 1948. If you haven't had a chance to view it, I encourage you to watch the video of the first panel of the series, Palestine Occupation, Settler Colonialism, and Apartheid, which can be found on the Center for Ideas and Society's YouTube channel. That panel addressed the impact on the Palestinian people of Gaza of the current genocidal actions by Israel, particularly on the medical infrastructure, the historical context for this violence, and the importance of seeing Israel as a settler colonial entity. The second panel, Palestine and the Law, discussed the lawfare, or warfare by law, enacted by Israel, as well as the possibilities and limits of contesting Israeli brutality through legal means, including the tactics, strategies, and discursive arenas of this struggle. It's important to inform you that one of the panelists on the second panel, the world-renowned feminist legal scholar Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, was arrested on April 18th and tortured during interrogation by the Israeli police. Dr. Shalhoub-Kevorkian's family and colleagues asked that the description of the condition she faced be shared. So this is from a social media post. They shackled her feet and hands, put her in solitary, a urine and cockroach-infested space, and gave her blankets with vomit on them. They kept the light on all night long and kept her room freezing. Her ear started bleeding from high blood pressure, and they denied her medication. They confiscated her computer, phone, every piece of new scholarship she was working on, and books from her home. They also questioned her about academic colleagues. It was her own university that facilitated the arrest through their own repression. She was released, but is now facing interrogation again today. This is a horrific situation, one that many Palestinians face at the hands of the Israeli settler state and its violent policing and carceral system. This is one of the many reasons it's important that we hold conversations, such as the one we are holding here, that we show up for the protests that are currently sweeping US campuses and campuses internationally, that as many people speak out as possible to bring protection in numbers, and that we engage the multiple facets of the struggle from every angle, some of which our panelists will speak about today. I want to say our thoughts are with Dr. Shalhoub-Kevorkian, but thoughts are of course not enough. Yet, decolonizing the mind is an essential part of the struggle. For more on Dr. Shalhoub-Kevorkian's situation, please read David Lloyd's recent piece in Mondowise, Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian and the Liquidation of All Untruths. And so I also just want to note that if there's time, the plan is to be able to try to answer audience questions. And so you can put those in the Q&A, and towards the end of our session today, we'll try to answer them. Our panelists will try to answer them. Okay, so now I'd like to welcome our panelists, Rana Barakat, Lubna Khatami, and Amin Hussein. Rana Barakat is Associate Professor of History and Contemporary Arab Studies and Director of the Museum at Birzeit University in Palestine. Her research interests include the history and historiography of colonialism, nationalism, and cultures of resistance. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Chicago and has published in notable venues, including the Journal of Palestine Studies, Jerusalem Quarterly, Settler Colonial Studies, and Native American and Indigenous Studies. Her forthcoming book, Lifta and Resisting the Museumification of Palestine, Indigenous History of the Nakba, advances an indigenous understanding of time, space, and memory in Palestine by focusing on the details of the people and place of Lifta village over time. She is currently working on her next book, The Baroque Revolt, Constructing a History of Resistance in Palestine, which argues that this 1929 revolt was the first sign in the Mandate period of sustained mass resistance to the settler colonial project, including direct and rhetorical actions against both political Zionism and British imperialism, planting seeds of mass political mobilization. Our second panelist, Lubna Khatami, is a Brown University postdoctoral research associate in Palestinian studies and an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Khatami is a former president's postdoctoral fellow from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and received her PhD from the Department of Ethnic Studies here, where I'm at the University of California, Riverside, and an MA from the College of Ethnic Studies, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities, and Diasporas program at San Francisco State University. Khatami's research examines transnational Palestinian youth movements after the 1993 Oslo Accords through the present. Her work is based on scholar-activist ethnographic research methods. Khatami's broader scholarly interests include Palestine, critical refugee studies, the racialization of Arab Muslim communities in the US, settler colonialism, youth movements, transnationalism, and indigenous and third world feminism. Khatami was a co-founder of the Palestinian Youth Movement and is currently a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And our third panelist, Amin Hussein, has a BA in philosophy and political science, a JD from Indiana University School of Law, and a Master of Laws from Columbia Law School. He practiced law for 5 years before transitioning to art. Amin also studied at the International Center for Photography and did the Whitney Independent Studies Studio program. Amin, along with Natasha Dillon, are co-founders of entail Collective, a collaboration that joins research, aesthetics, organizing, and action in its practice. entail, in turn, is a founder and editor of Anemones and Title Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy, both movement-generated theory magazines. Global Ultra Luxury Faction, the Direct Action Wing of Gulf Labor Artists Coalition, Direct Action Front for Palestine and NYC, Decolonize This Place, an art action-oriented decolonial formation in New York City and beyond, and most recently, the Strike MoMA Working Group of the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperial Feelings. Currently, MTL is in post-production titled Unsettling, which is an experimental film about land, life, and liberation today. Thank you all so much for being here. Okay. Rana, I'd like to start with you. In your work, you take an historical approach to understanding the ongoing Nakba as one that is anti-Indigenous, that operates through the settler colonial mechanisms of what Patrick Wolf famously describes as elimination. So I think it'd be good to begin with an understanding of these processes and structures. Would you mind walking us through some of them and how indigeneity operates within the Palestinian context, especially considering the Zionist use of claims to indigeneity to justify Israeli occupation, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocidal violence against Palestinians, which is part of the formation and maintenance of the settler state. Why is it important to understand the Palestinian liberation struggle as an indigenous struggle?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Mark, for that kind of massive question. I'd like to begin by thanking you and stating something quite obvious, that the unimaginable violence of this iteration of the genocide against Palestine and Palestinians has been difficult to place into historical context, as necessary as I agree with you as it is to do. I think we need to simply together recognize that simple yet paralyzing reality before we begin. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the hard work of my friends and colleagues in trying to move mountains, including demanding that our historical context and how we speak to this madness of Zionist settler colonial genocidal violence, and insisting on the power of our voices. This means thanking everyone at UC Riverside, including you, Mark, and my fellow panelists, Lubna and Amin. It's an honor to be in conversation with you all. I also want to acknowledge and celebrate all of our voices, the global intifada that we see on your campuses and campuses throughout the Turtle Island, and the intifada that is our ongoing demand to life and living in Palestine and amongst us Palestinians that I see on my campus here at Birzeit University and campuses throughout Palestine. That's why every university in Gaza has been attacked. That's why every university in the occupied West Bank is a constant target of settler violence. Settlers and settler colonialism cannot tolerate our voices, and that's why they work in all of the nefarious ways they do to try to silence us and erase us. But this global intifada is huge and it will change the world. Of that, I am certain. To engage your question, I want to begin by saying that settler colonial violence targets everything and everyone. We also know that settler violence, Zionism, is at this point a massacre making machine. It targets our relationality with the land of Palestine. But however brutal the genocidal violence is, and it is beyond words in its brutality, our relationality to the land and to each other will not be broken. Palestinian liberation is about sustaining, nurturing, and returning to our relationality with the land and with each other. That this echoes other Indigenous peoples is not a coincidence, and it should not go without notice. Also, in engaging this question, a historian like myself has to go through the rehearsal of remembering the history of the Nakba War to present the concept of the ongoing Nakba. The past 202 days, however, has changed how I think, how I present, how I seek conversations. This is a huge watershed in terms of history, as being of the past and history of the present. That is, the spectacle of Zionist settler colonial violence is omnipresent and inescapable. We must note this as well as be wary of it. The spectacle of violence is very real and terribly material. A live streaming genocide in Gaza is beyond humanity's ability to comprehend, but the apocalypse is not new. The events that we see unfold before us and amongst us have their historical context. More than a century of settler violence in Palestine and more than 5 centuries of settler violence in our worlds. This is where the historian or someone who thinks about longer narratives takes a pause. For the past matters, the present matters, and the future matters. But temporality in these divisions perhaps has mattered more than they should. That is, none of this is new, and it all also feels so intense that it feels new. None of this is only about Palestine and Palestinians. We know this has a longer history because of the history of settler colonialism. As beautifully described in a recent statement by California Indigenous Studies and Scholars Association, we know that a call for solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians is about who we are and about understanding the ways that we come together as a collective we. And I want to quote the letter quickly. Quote, as the Indigenous peoples of California, we know all too well the devastating effects of settler colonial occupation on our lands, bodies, and worlds. We also know that settler states justify their genocidal violence by demonizing those who survive and resist. End quote. I need to constantly emphasize the use of the word we in this statement and many other statements. And so there it is. This is a Palestinian story, but it's also a shared story amongst Indigenous peoples in all kinds of geographies that have faced the brutality of settler colonial violence. Now, I just want to speak really quickly about the Nakba War that happened between 1947 and 1949 in order to be able to just introduce into our conversation the notion of the ongoing Nakba. So to do this, I want to do this to give a larger landscape and a sense of the landscape of settler violence. And by larger, I mean both in terms of temporality and spatial conceptions. So really quickly, if we can go to the 29th of November 1947, when the newly formed United Nations presented a partition plan to quote unquote solve the quote unquote conflict. At the end of the colonial mandate era and the further solidification of settlement, mostly European at that point in Palestine, this moment was when the mandate, a British colonial mandate, basically ended. But even this moment, often read as the beginning of the Nakba War, did not begin in 1947. In fact, the entire structure of the British mandate in Palestine was a large structure of violence that was created in part to support a European settler colonial movement. That is, throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s of the previous century. The colonial government basically came up with this iteration of a quote unquote conflict that it later claimed to hand over to the United Nations. Moreover, the echoes of partition long predated 1947, for the British had attempted to present a partition nearly a decade before in lieu of a Palestinian revolt. And as we all know, partition has been a constant and violent tool of settler colonialism. Gaza, as a strip after all, is part of this ongoing history. Fragmentation, division, and captivity have been tools of violence that accompany displacement, dispossession, and erasure in the settler arsenal. These are not new in Palestine, nor are Palestinians the only victims. Historians often divide the Nakba War into stages. These stages both mark the intensity of the violence on a metric of how centrally organized it was by either Zionist militias or later the Central Army. And the stages also mark the geographies of violence. And here I want to refer you to great historians who write and talk a lot about this, including Rosemary Syed. Read her. You will all be better for it. There are generations of Palestinians writing about this, thinking about this. Intellectual and political space is important. Equally important is that we read and listen to those who have come before us and are amongst us. So if we think of with Palestinian historians, we understand that the Nakba is both an event that happens and continues to happen. And to be clear, the Nakba War is understood as an invasion, and it has stages of invasion, revealing how Plan Dalit was a Zionist military plan of conquest. From the early stages of the war in late 1947, where well-armed militias and later the Central Army attacked beginning with the coastal regions in cities like Jaffa, and continued through the heart of Palestine, connecting the coast with Jerusalem, including Ramla in between. Settlers and settler colonies predated this invasion by several decades, but this invasion was a war of dispossession, and that war of dispossession continues to this day. The plan was exactly that, a military plan of invasion. Destroy to replace. The subsequent stages of lasted from the summer into the winter months of 1948, following the geography of Palestine into the north and later the south of the lands of Palestine. By late summer of 1949, Palestine had been transformed into a landscape of violence and fragmentation. By the summer of 1949, nearly 3/4 of the population were violently forced from their homes and homeland by a settler army and armies of settlers. We suddenly became refugees, forced into exile both on our land and in the Shadat, a people without the most basic of rights. And the violence of the war continued well after. This is what we call the ongoing Nakba, the violence of a settler army and armies of settlers. Nearly 8 decades on, the settler state continues. What we are seeing now from the coast of Gaza to the hills of the West Bank is the violence of the ongoing Nakba. Palestinian resistance is this everlasting and enduring being of, from, and on the land. Again, that this echoes other peoples in geographies across the globe is not a coincidence. Ours is a struggle against the same modes of power and operations of logic that have ravaged our worlds.
Thank you so much, Rana, for that really powerful and sort of detailed discussion of the structures as well as the histories, as well as the attention to like the deep scholarship that Palestinian scholars have produced over the decades in order to analyze and track all of these violences that are going on, as well as making the connection towards indigenous populations around the world. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to Lubna. In both your scholarship and activist work, you emphasize the significance of grassroots movements in education, whether that be the Palestinian youth and feminist movements or the figure of the Fedayeen in both the diaspora and in Palestine. Would you mind telling us about Palestinian resistance, how it operates in movement building and scholarship, at their intersections as an activist scholar yourself, and in making connections across struggles, something that Rana began alluding to there? How does resistance, both as praxis and interpretive lens, help us understand the historical as well as the current situation in Palestine?
Thank you so much for that question. Thank you all for being here. I'm really honored to be on this panel with Rana and Amin and Mark, and really couldn't say no for the UCR community, which I'm a proud alumni of, and I'm really happy to be back, even if virtually. I think I want to maybe start by picking up on what Rana mentioned in the very beginning about what's currently happening with the encampments that are spreading across cities across the globe, campuses across the globe. I've been meeting with students at different encampments this week, and one of the things that I've been saying to all of them is reiterating a Frantz Fanon quote, where he said that each generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission and fulfill it or betray it. And I think that this quote is really important for the students to hear, in part because what I think is happening and what has been happening among the student movement, whether they're Palestinian students or co-strugglers of the Palestinian struggle, is that it is about a generation together, collectively deciding and constructing what their mission is. And I think we are currently in a moment where they are making decisions, sometimes very quick decisions, on whether or not they are planning on fulfilling it or betraying it. I want to start off by just saying that because I think that this has been a key feature of Palestinian resistance across generations and across geographies. Palestinian resistance, as Rana said, has been inspired by the land, has been inspired by our colonial condition, by an ongoing Nakba that has traversed generations and geographies, whether it is in the Gaza Strip or in the heartland of Palestine, the lands occupied in 1948, or in the hills of the West Bank. We have seen over the course of many generations a renewal of resistance through different modes, through different frameworks, through different kind of technologies of implementation. But nonetheless, we have seen a renewal after every phase of defeat, after every rupture and fissure, and after periods of time and moments of catastrophe where entire communities were decimated or entire parties were destroyed, or the leaders of political movements were arrested, deported, or imprisoned. This kind of renewal of resistance that we've seen across Palestinian time, we've also seen across Palestinian geographies, right? We have seen periods of time where Europe was really the heart of diasporic resistance efforts. We are now in a moment where North America has really stepped up over the course of the last decade. We have seen periods of time where entire organizations have, experienced colossal collapse of organizational infrastructure, but new organizations have emerged in their place. And I think the reason why I'm talking about this kind of variation of how Palestinian resistance has been renewed across time and place is because, for me, it's really important to think about it in relationship to what the Palestinian colonial condition has been for us. So we think about the original event of the Nakba of 1948, which displaces 750,000 Palestinians from their land. That original period after 1948, this is not to say that resistance and organization didn't exist prior to 48, but after the Nakba, the original student movements that were growing in that period of time were growing in exile, right? They were students in Cairo and Beirut and Damascus and Baghdad, of course, in the land of Palestine as well. But they were student movements, and that eventually led to political parties, that eventually led to, events in history that held the power to change the course of history. Those were growing in many different places across the globe. But the Palestinian condition has been marked by many, many moments of catastrophic violence, right? That has, for example, the Palestinian revolution that launches itself in Jordan in the early 1960s was displaced from Jordan in 1970, and then displaced again from Lebanon. The PLO was expelled from Lebanon in 1982, following and followed by the massacres of Savran Shatila camp, right? So we have seen so many different iterations of Palestinian political struggle, whether it's been launched by the organized guerrilla organizations or the parties. We've seen it hold the centrality of its power in Jordan, then in Lebanon, and then especially during the Stones Intifada in the late 1980s, the heartland, the homeland becomes really the site of the center of resistance, right? So we've seen it operate in so many different geographies across so many different periods of time, but we've also seen it experience so much different kind of catastrophic violence. And we've seen the Palestinians have to recreate their resistance and recreate technologies of resistance and methods of resistance in really unlivable conditions. I mention all of this because I think one thing that I think has been a thread for the many different generations of Palestinian students and youth and feminist organizers and, other popular and grassroots mobilizations is that there is something about the material condition of being occupied and dispossessed that creates the desire and the need to find an answer, right? To find an explanation for why we are deprived. Some of us, we are deprived of much more material freedoms and rights than others, but for others, there is a deprivation of even the right to access our land that might not be registered for many as a material occupation or dispossession, but it's still a deprivation that sits within us as Palestinians. That condition has led so many of us to the process of finding answers to questions that were ultimately transformative answers. In the process of asking our elders, in the process of meeting other Palestinian young people, in the process of reading literature that could explain how what we are feeling and what we are experiencing was not our experience alone, but actually the experience of an entire people, that there was a root condition that explained this condition that we were individually feeling. I think that sewed the threads between Palestinians across generations, whether it's through literature, oral history telling, or so forth. And that initial explanation of our conditions, I think then leads to the beginning of a revolutionary consciousness. And I think a revolutionary consciousness, if it's cultivated and if it's nurtured in community, in collectivity, can lead to revolutionary organization. And I think revolutionary organization, as our history has taught us, has led to revolutionary programs. And I think revolutionary programs have led to revolutionary changes and trajectory for the entirety of the people. I'm not trying to be super meta, but I think that there's a relationship between material conditions of deprivation and occupation and dispossession and the kind of work that it takes to organize resistance. Palestinians will always have an instinct to resist. Our life is on the land. Our lives are on the line. Our land is on the line. So much of our history following the Oslo Accords has told us that when we surrendered our resistance, we lost more land and life than when we were actively fighting. So there will always be that instinct and there will always be that need to resist. But I think the question of how we have organized our resistance across generations and geographies, how we have renewed resistance when people thought that had been crushed, I think that these are the things that have kept the Palestinian struggle alive and kicking, and a site for not just renewal for Palestinians, but a site that is reminding, generations even today that there is, the promise of return and liberation, not just for Palestinians, but for so many struggles of the world that has not been complete, that we are still in an incomplete revolution. We are still in an incomplete struggle. And I think a lot of the students that I've been speaking with across campuses here on Turtle Island, they have a very clear consciousness that this is not just about edifying the incomplete dream of Palestinian freedom and return, but it's about actually bringing back to life the living histories of revolutionaries in this country or on this land, Indigenous and otherwise, who they understand that they are continuing their work, that they understand that they are trying to fulfill and continue a project of revolutionary consciousness building and transformative change that hasn't been finished because of the world that we live in. I think they think of that revolutionary consciousness and program and organization as the work of revolutionary world making. And I think that is what a lot of the students that I've been speaking with have been testifying to.
Thank you so much, Lubna, for that wonderful discussion of revolutionary consciousness making, the history, the dynamism. To go to Fanon again, the idea that the resistance in some ways matches the oppression, right? And just that discussion of the intergenerational connections between Palestinians who have resisted, as well as you put it, the way that revolutionary consciousness is being spread from Palestine to others. That's such a beautiful way of putting that. Thank you. So I'd like to turn now to Amin. I wanted to ask a question because you have a pretty unique situation with your training in the legal field and having been a lawyer, as well as your really deep work in at the intersection of art and politics. You engage in museum studies. I'm thinking especially of your work with the MTL Collective. And so I think that puts you in a position to speak to how the different forms of resistance, something that Lubna was just talking about as well, but like what kinds of forms that those that resistance can take. So I'm wondering if you would mind discussing the historical and current forms of the Palestinian liberation struggle, some of the legal, political, and representational frameworks in which they operate, perhaps, and how aesthetic practices inform or can inform modes of resistance. And then if you want to, that's a lot of writing. Speak to how that connects to our theme of Indigenous resistance. Thank you.
Wow. I mean, I think anchoring it in contemporary moment and then kind of bringing up these things is probably a good way to go. I mean, October 7th was an assertion of a right to exercise people's self-determination beyond their representation that's being recognized by the international community. That's still at the crux of what's going on right now. So is October 7th something to be evaluated and valued in this world by these laws or by the worlds that we're trying to create? So it's not just simply resistance as a form of, healing, as a form of refusal, but really it's part of a strategy of world making. And I think there the we comes in, right? So that political community that's being constructed in the process of struggle. Forms then are just forms are connected to people's positionalities and material conditions. But I think one of the things about October 7th is that it opens up a crack to think planetarily about this moment. That's different in decolonial struggles and anti-colonial struggles than the 50s and 60s. Because the 50s and 60s, to the extent that they were predicated on the right to self-determination as recognized by international law, the point was that, you want to get free? Here's a state. But that was the advent of neocolonialism. And here we are from, the uprisings of 2011 or, whatever that period was to now, 2010, 2011. A series of movements in the United States also were happening. And I think now we're at this point where it's like October 7th is, again, it's like, from a U.S. standpoint or any settler colonized people, or colonization, what's going on there? People not willing to, co-sign on their death. And through this act, meaning, is it prudent to resist when power balance or power, period, brute power is not on your side? Well, in one world, no, you shouldn't. In their world, you shouldn't. In our world, in a Palestinian struggle kind of context, but for that extent, anyone that's trying to get free beyond the nation state, right? Then you're going to say yes, and you're going to measure things differently, right? And it's going to meaning, so much of how you live is also how you choose to die, and where you choose to sacrifice, and how do you choose to live. Right? So then it opens up this is why this is a dangerous moment for the current world order. Because in a way, it's like they've ran people to this point, and Palestinians had both the courage and the foresight, right, to take this stand. And that opens up the possibility of anti-assimilationist, non-assimilationist options. This is directly connected to things around modernity. Modernity, the advent of colonization, the compression of space time, putting everyone on one clock, right? Everyone been talking about in art or in politics or in da-da-da-da. But okay, so if we're talking about decolonization and getting free and beyond national boundaries and thinking how do we resist together and whatever, I think there it's really important to recognize that, oh yes, this modernity idea where you join a world order that has these kind of laws, you saw it in the 60s and 70s, what happened in the 50s in the Bandung Conference, never allowed to materialize. So if you're people that are choosing now, is this connected to the Palestinian struggle? Of course. I mean, that was an example of that would be Basil Araj. Because in that basic thing, he's saying that, to be a revolutionary, you necessarily have to be an outlaw. right? That doesn't mean everyone breaks the law and that's your strategy, but it does mean that you're actually have no allegiance to the country or place, right, that's oppressing you, even if they look like you. And I think they tried in 2020 to kill that by diversity, equity, and inclusion, which now has produced the crisis that you see on campuses, right, from 2020 onward, like since 2011. So, you know, that's in terms of, so I'm saying, like, in terms of the law, it's really important October 7th to realize that it's an assertion of rights by people, but it also brings the problem that we all already knew, which is people can't be represented. You know, and that's a challenge. That's a question, meaning how do we struggle? How do we defend? How do we grow? How do we come up with our own language? How do we learn to do these things? And how do we exist, because you can't withdraw, right? And you don't want to withdraw. I mean, that's what's interesting about the student movement. I mean, as a faculty, I got fired, you know, for what? For saying what I'm saying, even though I was hired to say it, right? So the question for me, just as a human being, not even, maybe that's too racist, but as a person, it's like, do I accept that? Therein lies the resistance, you know, and you see that in the colonial gaze. When they look at you, what does a soldier want you to do? To look down. And what are you supposed to do? Not do that. And you get beat up, sure, but who won? It's how you value it. So you see what I'm saying? Like the idea of resistance inside. I mean, that's what I learned from the first uprising. That's what I see, the evolution of revolutionary consciousness that happens because, you know, people resist all the time, and people are living all the time. So part of it is a recognition. But that's also why we're focusing on pedagogy and, you know, and how do you learn? And how do you, you know, how do we recognize and towards what we're oriented? So, you know, I think of it that way. And I think that it's also a return to the land, but you have to unsettle 500 years. But in unsettling 500 years, then there's a strategy of how you build coalition of the oppressed, right? Or the dispossessed or whomever. And that's part of what I think we've used institutions for. In institutions, it's the most direct way where the state meets our lives, whether it's a school or a university or a museum or whatever. It's all a program, and you see it in Palestine. The reason they're shutting it down is because you're using an institution against itself, its own laws, by belonging. And therein lies the crisis. I teach at NYU. I teach Justice Lab. I always talk about Palestine. Why do I talk about Palestine? Because I have an analysis from, you know, I am where I think and do. And from New York City, not just as whoever I am, from this place, I am what I think and do. And the question is, how do I get free? Now, how do I free others? How do I personally get free? And we've said through Decolonize This Place, after a series of failures of trying, which is part of learning, right? But after a series of failures, that the triangulation of struggle of a free Palestine, and for this matter, from the river to the sea, it has to be said, right? A free Palestine, Black liberation, and Indigenous sovereignty, right? That triangulation of struggle can upend empire. But it's also a basis upon which we can come together. In New York City, every sites of struggle have their specificity. But, you know, if the challenges are planetary, our approach should be planetary, right? And I think that's where I think I like, you know, I mentioned Bassel a lot because it resembles a lot of the refusal of the Zapatistas. A no can produce a million yeses. You know, it has its own specificity, you know, taking tours. You can have museum tours that do what Bassel was doing, except with Bassel, he gets murdered. And here you pay for it. But I want to say one last thing about freedom because it's a challenge. To the extent that people say freedom, 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 freedom from, freedom to, all these kind of things, whatever it is, there's a basic thing that has to do with materiality. So time, space, and matter. But the material conditions are really important to think about this. So, I lost my train of thought, but this was an important point about freedom. Okay, so in the context of the university, right? NYU is the largest landowner, one of the three. Who are the two others in New York City? Not any city, New York City. It'd be Columbia, and it would be Trinity Wall Street Church. And the Trinity Wall Street Church and its land were bequeathed by the Queen of England. The Columbia University got chartered in Wall Street, right? These histories are to inform the present, right? But they're also to inform the present in terms of who do you need to say what, and what acts are legitimate and on what basis. Because you know what I'm saying? So then, but then look at the students that are leading this movement and say, what is the condition of freedom in the United States? Leaving the electoral politics, no one has time and no one has space. So it produces alienation. It produces an economy out of dealing with alienation that then stratifies society, that makes them in the rat. I mean, you want to see how it plays out today? Just look at a university. Every institution mimics the broader structure, but we belong to these institutions. So then you can say, okay, I'm not speaking in the abstract. What's going on here? I have to teach, right, people about freedom, knowing that I put them in $100,000 worth of debt. Really? That's what I have to do? And what does my students have to do? To actually be in debt studying about freedom, so when they graduate, they don't think about how do I get free. They think about how do I make money to pay my debt to get free. Really? And then they call the cops on you when you're trying to stand up for something that is about fucking freedom. And they're creating debt prisons. And they're changing laws as they wish. So, okay, you defend private property, which comes from their world, right? Because you don't want to get in trouble. You respect it. And then they tell you you're still trespassing. Why? Because you said something you shouldn't say, like globalize the Intifada, or this is a Zionist institution, or this is a Zionist city. That's, I think, for me as a person who's living outside of Palestine because I'm forced to live outside of Palestine, and I go and now I'm thinking, did I say too much that won't allow me in? Because you know what I mean? But these are the moments in which people have to really assess, because no one's going to get me free. I know that much. And I know I can't get free by myself. I know that too. And I know there's a lot of people that I would agree with me. Okay. So then how do we make that happen? And I think the students are opening up a space. It's just the beginning. The universities are flowing onto the streets. The institutions are trying to create the divide. You're part of an institution. What part of Colombia is just Colombia? If the land is stolen and they own slaves and they actually, they create the imperial education and the next class of people that are going to rule, you know, why would it just be students then now negotiating on what the demands are? That wasn't 68. You know what I'm saying? I think these are lessons. I think this generation knows it. That's the other thing that's exciting about this.
Thank you so much, Amin. There's a lot to think about there. That was a really wonderful sort of discussion of the material conditions for sure, but the way that those material conditions get obscured and produce all of these different like knots, essentially, that I saw you describing, like how do we untangle all of these different knots, right? And those knots are also at the same time deeply connected to all of these different situations. I mean, there's just so much to think about there. And I think that actually is a good transition to the next question I have. And so what I wanted to ask, and everyone's already been speaking to this to some extent, and so I just wanted to maybe state the question a little bit more clearly. But building off this discussion of resistance that you have all spoken to, what does decolonization look like in Palestine? What does it look like right now? How has it, looked in the past? What are the material realities, potential pathways, impediments? What is needed And so I don't know if maybe Lubna, would you like to take this question, if that's okay?
Yeah, feels like a bit of a jarring shift in some ways, but also a continuation of what we were all thinking through in the first round. I mean, I think I'll just be brief because I would love to have this be, conversational between us. But I think decolonization is about the land, but it's also about the body and the mind and the soul and the society and all the kind of ways that we can transform as beings. And that requires fundamental transformation of the world that we live in and the systems that we are sort of conditioned, I think, as Amin said, to accept as normalized, as naturalized, as the given order of things. To be a little bit less in the lofty dream place, I will say that, a lot of people talk about decolonization being about epistemology, and we hear decolonize this and decolonize that every day and everywhere. But Palestinians are in the midst of decolonizing their land, and they have galvanized a lot of love, but they also galvanized a lot of hate and ambivalence, a very intentional ambivalence. I think that one of the things that decolonization in the present moment kind of has revealed is that, Amin earlier talked about the distinctions of being in the 1950s and 1960s and in this moment. But I think that there's also a lot of things about this moment that we actually have to uncover in order to actually understand how politics still works. Yes, we live in a unipolar world. Yes, we live after, the Cold War, but we also live in a world where Palestine's freedom is both hinged on and an opening for freedom of the region and of the world in many ways. And I think that what we're seeing in this moment of decolonization is that a lot of power is hanging in the balance. There's the power of the region, there's the power of the United States' presence in the region, there's the power of the history of the imperialist project in this region, which then extends to other regions, because we're talking about a region that connects Africa and Asia also, like not to forget that, right? There is the question of, and I think Amin laid it out about the universities today, like in so many ways, we're talking about Palestine, solidarity with Palestine, solidarity against the genocide happening in real time. But what's starting to be destabilized is the question of the university itself, the power structure of the university, the corporate investment in the university, the way in which the university is actually not a site of free intellectual exchange, in which it doesn't privilege transformative and critical pedagogy. So I think that decolonization is certainly like not to abstract Palestine from what is happening there, the severity of the material conditions, the fact that land is very much a real factor in material decolonization, the fact that Palestinians have exhausted all means at their disposal, from popular protests to appealing to international courts to art and cultural work to political formation building to mobilization to lobbying, have done everything over the course of the last century, and that armed resistance continues to be one form of resistance amidst an array of different forms of resistance that Palestinians have practiced. They are practicing that, but at the same time, their practice toward freedom is revealing that to achieve Palestinian liberation, a lot of structures have to actually endure a transformation as well. We're not going to be able to realize a free Palestine so long as we can't talk about Palestine. If you can't talk about Palestine, then that means that freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of education, academic freedom are not naturalized givens. And so this is, for me, like my long way of saying the simple thing that we've all known to be true, which is that Palestinians, our freedom is hinged on the freedom of others and other regions and other institutions, but also vice versa. And I think that this is a moment where a lot of people are realizing that solidarity with Palestine isn't about us being the recipients of their pity or being, just the physical place that people go for solidarity tourism, take photos and come and speak on our behalf back to the Western world. Palestine is a place and a site and a method of resistance and decolonization that is inspiring and teaching a lot of people around the world. And I think that that's important, that we are really starting to like think reciprocally and dialectically about how we achieve freedom together.
Thank you, Lubna. Yeah, I think that also speaks to Amin's point about planetarity, and what has become a really, I think, profound refrain, which is Palestine is going to free us all, right? It's a universal struggle, so I very much appreciate your comments there. I wanted to see if anybody else wanted to speak to that question, and also just kind of add if anybody would like to maybe talk about the texts, thinkers, figures, movements, things that people can turn to that are influential for beginning to answer this question.
If I could just sort of dovetail on what Lubna was saying, beautifully, actually opening for and hinged upon. And I think if we think that way, we can think about the continuities of history as well as the sort of contradictions of them. So I agree with what Amin was saying about this moment, but I also think it's important for us to think about the longer historical narrative of all of these moments, right? So this is not, I think what's new, what I was referring to earlier, what seems to be new is the kind of the unimaginable kind of violence that's being visited upon the people of Palestine, and particularly Gaza, and how survival has become, it's something that we have to really think about. And so if we're thinking in a decolonial context, that is what Lubna was referring to earlier, is kind of thinking through words and conceptual meanings and how those have changed over time, but also, this refusal or resistance is certainly not new in Palestine. And it is as long as the history of colonialism is in Palestine. So I think, and there are ways of thinking about how the world has been in relation with Palestinians, and how Palestinians have been in relation with the world, that Lubna spends a lot of her time working on, that have both changed over time, and there's continuities with them since the 1920s, not just a post-48 phenomenon, right? So one of the pieces that I often find people read is Ghassan Kanafani writing about the 1936 revolt, and that it echoes the Mandate era, the colonial Mandate era, something that is echoed in what one can perhaps call the colonial Oslo era, because it looks a little different, but there's a lot of the same logics that are being operated upon. And I think, when Amin was referring to sort of getting free and thinking about what that means, there's so many voices. There's a symphony of voices that we can refer to. And most recently, Walid Daqqa passed on. He was murdered after 38 years of incarceration. As he's a political prisoner, and on April 7th, he passed. And there's a quote that one can stick in one's mind often. And he wrote, "The most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And he wrote that in 2004. And I guess we translated it as molding consciousness. And in that piece, in that small booklet, he was talking about how Israeli settler colonialism, both within the small prison of prisons and within the large prison of captivity, works not only to bind and keep the mind in the body in prison, but also works on the mind. And he's in that, we can see him echoing, and he's being echoed. A lot of what Amin was saying about getting free and thinking about what freedom is. So I would just want to give a larger historical sort of analysis, and saying that this moment is really important, but reminding us all that this moment is a series of moments, a century's worth of them. And to speak to what Amin was talking about with regards to modernity, and we know that the university, like the museum, is a potent symbol of European modernity. And it is a challenge to think about what decolonizing that is. Within the university, it is what Lubna was speaking to about, sort of what a pedagogy of a liberatory pedagogy might look like and feel like. And it's not, again, not a coincidence that every university in Gaza was one of the first targets throughout October and November. Every university. Right now, we have no functioning universities. We're speaking structurally, physically, and practically. That's not, again, a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we have more than 100 of our students at Beard State University who've been arrested since 2021. That's, again, not a coincidence. So I agree that the university is a problematic structure in terms of reproducing the ethics and logics of modernity, white, racist, capitalist modernity. But it's also, it has a great deal of potential and possibility. And that's why we're here. I think that's why we're saying what we're saying. That's why these encampments are so vital. That's why thinking about sort of the thread that Lubna was referring to earlier between, if we can just talk about campuses, between campuses under occupation in Palestine and elsewhere, that this conversation is one that I think we're all committed to nurturing, not because of the university as a structure, but because of who we are as intellectuals within it and around it.
Yeah, thank you, Rana, especially for the reminder the commitments not to the institution, and that it really is about those who are being in some way subjected to it, but also the potential that exists, both in terms of the knowledge that, there's, as you pointed to, there's an epistemicide going on in Gaza, there's scholasticide. It's a direct targeting of knowledge formations. So thank you for those comments. Did you want to respond to this question, Amin?
I think I can add. I think that, again, the institution is, what is it? I don't know what it is. Is it an infrastructure? Is it an ideology? Is it a top-down? Is it the workers? Is it whatever? It's a complex entity, and it depends how it's used, but it's part of a larger structure. So then the question that actually comes to mind is one that Fred Moon and Stefano Harney talk about, which is just like, do you take over the plantation and reform it? That was the history of the 20th century. I'm not fighting for a nation state. I think it's okay for colonized people to recognize that they don't agree. I think sites of difference are sites of construction. I think the we is in process. I think that we need to talk about, you mentioned Ghassan Kanafani, we need to talk about class. Who gets to decide? Oslo, who was represented and who wasn't? And who got prioritized in the process, so on a process to get free? And who came from outside and took everything? And why would you die for a struggle like that? And why would you want to live? Why would a struggle like that make you want to live? It isn't decolonization. I don't know what decolonization means in Arabic. I'm not into decolonizing this and that and the other. I'm interested in getting free and creating and world making in the process. Now you have people working at now if you get to that point of let's say a principle in which we're discussing, then it isn't about who's working at the museum or not, but what is the allegiance and what is the political project that is other than that? And who comes with it? One thing the Palestinian liberation struggle should teach everyone is you could have 30 factions that are all across the spectrum, but the idea of getting free and the contradictions get resolved in process. And I think that there are challenges, because you could look at the Kurdish movement and how it tried to get free and how it thought of institutions. Because if you're trying to hold on to the thing, you're prioritizing the thing that gives them leverage on you. And how do you do that differently? Or if you're looking at the Kurdish level of, let's say, actually, you could think of Israel as doing the same thing. Benjamin Netanyahu is doing PR to the outside world, creating a cover for crazy radical fascist Zionist ideology to take over the West Bank and Gaza, right? That duality is what the Kurds did in trying to hold on during the Syrian revolution, right? These are the contradictions that any people that is trying to get free is going to have to negotiate in this world order. It's not about being unipolar or multipolar. It's about how the boundaries don't define the things that we believe in the process of how do we get free. So when we did actions against the museums, not everyone was happy with them. But we also never did them against people that thought they believed in them. The issue is how can a mature struggle maintain a diversity of strategy and tactics where, let's say, you have a representative body like the PA doesn't sell people like Basil al-Araj or the resistance in order to get free? For whom? This is connected to the we that we're trying to construct. And I think that these complexities are things that the Palestinian struggle doesn't hide. Who killed Nizar Banat? And who funded the thing, right? So these, I'm not saying, for example, I'm not saying that this is a unique moment. I'm saying that it's a repeated moment that raises the same questions, and it's good to excavate the reasons for why we do things so we can see whether we should do them the same way or differently.
Thank you. So I think the point that you brought up about contradictions, about this kind of sense of a duality that operates as a type of PR for Israel is a really important point to sort of transition to the last question that I'd like to ask. But before I do that, I actually want to remind people in the audience that if you'd like to ask questions, to put them into the Q&A box, and we'll return to those. And this is also going to sort of harken back a little bit to something that Rana was talking about at the very beginning in relationship to where I'm at right now physically in California, California Indigenous homelands. I'm currently sitting, in Gabrielino territory. But, I think one of the things that is important to think about is how the question of violence, or the way in which violence has been narrated, like what that ends up doing in terms of that type of PR, right? Like what the kind of logics are, the illogics as well of the narration of violence in this struggle. And so even just to situate it where I'm at right now, I'm a descendant of people who struggled against the US military, right? Like physically in guerrilla warfare. And the Southern California was the site of multiple revolts, right, against the US settler colonial state. And so, in this case of settler colonialism, violence tends to get narrated as being inherent to indigenous peoples, right? That's just like it gets naturalized. Whereas settler violence tends to be the violence of, which is violence of genocidal dispossession. It generally gets understood as defense, right? We can see the IDF, the term IDF, which is not a term that is applicable to reality. It's always understood as defense, which ends up creating a kind of impossible situation that, any actions by a besieged indigenous population ends up being perceived as aggression, right? So we see this in the case of Palestinian resistance, the framing of armed resistance as terrorism, and the intentional murdering of tens of thousands of Palestinians, displacement of millions by Israel, as itself somehow a defense, right? As well as in the case of protests against the genocide and the occupation, right, against the ongoing Nakba. And so I just want to point to that recently and very starkly, mainstream media was filled with a fictitious story of a Jewish Zionist counter-protester being stabbed in the eye with a Palestinian flag, supposedly, which kind of amplified this false narrative that protests against Israel's genocide, apartheid, and occupation are anti-Semitic. And that's a story that ended up taking precedence over the very real discovery of mass graves in Khan Yunis, right? And so I think, like, thinking through how it is in these colonial situations and in relation to resistance, how violence gets understood is important. And so I just want to ask if anybody would like to speak to this question about how violence in liberation struggle is understood and how it relates to this concept of indigenous resistance, and maybe what are the relations between violent and nonviolent anti-colonial struggle. And so anybody who is interested in tackling that big question, please, we would be very grateful.
Well, I could just get us started, I suppose. I mean, I think the first thing, I think most of the folks who would be tuning into this discussion, they know what, the very different reads of Palestinian armed insurrection are. some who read it as armed resistance and some who read it as terrorism. And this isn't unique to Palestinians. This is a part of the racialized rubrics in which states and settler colonial entities have for centuries criminalized and tried to delegitimize indigenous and anti-colonial and anti-racist revolt and insurgency. I think for Palestinians, especially, and maybe this is a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think a lot of the times in the last 2 decades following the war on terror, a lot of namely liberals or even folks left of liberals, had problems with the way that we talked about, how we demonize all Muslims as terrorists, right? Or they took issue with the racial stereotype of Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians as terrorists, but there was not really the depth of looking to how so much of the terrorism apparatus in terms of the legal framework that's been built and the discourse that's been built has been entrenched in centuries, right? Like centuries of Orientalist literature and art that just describe this region as backward and barbaric and savage. And particularly since 1967, after this 1967 war and the rise of the Palestinian guerrillas really taking matters into their own hands, the language of terrorism really starts to take shape in new legal legislation passed in the United States in US law that kind of conflates Palestinians and Arabs, and particularly Palestinian Arab leftists, with the image of terrorism or under the language of terrorism. That wasn't original to Palestinians. I mean, they were calling, indigenous people, and they were calling Black revolutionaries terrorists and criminalizing them. They were all happening around the same time of revolution and counter-revolution of the late 1960s, especially, where this really starts to grow for us as Palestinians. But there is one other point that I just briefly want to sort of touch on about even those who can recognize that Palestinians are an occupied people who have a legal right to armed revolts because it's enshrined in international law because they are occupied. Even among those who empathize with Palestinians' rights to resistance, there sometimes seems to be a confusion about how and why Palestinians are using armed revolts. So I've definitely heard from folks even within the Palestine Solidarity Movement saying, why do Palestinian factions or groups or individuals use armed resistance when they know that they'll never be able to defeat the military capabilities or might of the Israeli state? And I think that this is something that really deserves and is deserving of attention, because what it reveals is that the entire philosophy of guerrilla warfare that's been practiced for over a century, not just by Palestinians, but by revolutionaries across the world, has totally sort of just been erased. I think guerrilla warfare, guerrillas always knew that they could never defeat the military technologies and capacities of the state based on what they had. They'd always admitted to being trained in rudimentary technologies, not having the physical capacity to occupy space the way an occupation might. But, there's so much literature from Fanon to Iqbal Ahmed, the Algerian revolutionaries to South African revolutionaries, the Palestinian political parties that talked about what the strategic aims of guerrilla warfare have been. A lot of those aims are social and psychological transformations in the society. A lot of those aims are political, a performance of political power that kind of lifts the myth that the occupation is invincible, right? And that is important to make people believe not just that freedom is possible, but that it's inevitable, right? I think that this has been one of the biggest revelations to people in the last 6 months about why Palestinians are fighting. And just to touch on it on the last point, there are a lot of non-armed methods of resistance that also have the power to do the same thing. So when people frame resistance as violent or non-violent, I sometimes get confused there, because the Israeli state and its Zionist institutions globally treat all of our resistance as criminal, right? Humanitarian organizations, children and youth associations, women's unions are being criminalized by the state of Israel under the rubric of terrorism. So they treat all of these forms of resistance as criminal because all of these forms of resistance expose their contradictions, expose that they are actually not a progressive society, that they are actually not a society that values human life, that they're not a society that practices democracy. And so that exposing of their contradictions, exposing of their points of military and political weakness, exposing of the ruthless brute force with which they fight in order to mask the fact that they actually don't have a lot of strategic military training, at least for ground warfare. I think that these are things that all forms of resistance, whether it's literature or storytelling or popular protest or armed insurgency, has the capacity to reveal. And I think that that is why the Israeli state and its institutions globally doesn't discriminate between what forms of resistance it's trying to crush.
Yeah, thank you, Lubna. Both in terms of situating the question of armed resistance in a sort of wider assemblage of like resistance itself at a broader scale, but also the fact that like whatever form ends up being sort of interpreted as a form of violence. I really appreciate that. Anybody else, would you like to answer this question?
I just like to, again, sort of dovetail onto what Lubna was saying humbly, is that if the question posed, Mark, is about violence, I think it's important for us to understand that the violence that we're talking about here is settler colonial violence again, right? And this notion, I think, this is where sort of zooming in on Palestine and sort of thinking about what Lubna was just offering us is that all forms of life and living are attacked, right? Are constantly. The criminalization is not of Palestinianness. It's not just resistance. We are criminalized as Palestinian. And that's echoed in other spaces and in other geographies, as Lubna was saying, and that that is part and parcel of imperialism. And I think one of the things that's really important, if decolonization is a verb, right? If we're thinking about it as a practice, it's about getting over this notion of triumph and defeat, because that's not our world and that's not our metric, right? That nation state or that independence is not the metrics of liberation. And I think this idea of permanence is the lie that settler colonialism wants to tell itself. So that entity that is married to violence is settler colonialism. And we can see that on display, right? So it's never going to be enough violence. And that's why it's always more violence, right? Force and power are not the same thing. And there's going to be, and there will continue to be, we're seeing this every day happening both throughout occupied Palestine, right? And so I think it's really important to think about the fact that the violence and this drive towards permanency, which will never happen, as we know, as I've learned from your work, Mark, is that this idea of permanence is the lie that settler colonial tells itself. And what Lubna was saying earlier is that all forms of life are attacked. All forms of life are attacked. Life and vitality, from the armed struggle to a daily sort of living in life. And so one of the things that we noticed, and this is zooming in again, one of the things that was clearly on display beginning in early October was that the military might and machine of this settler state was attacking bakeries bakeries, schools, and hospitals. Those three things were being and continue to be attacked. So they're attacking life, right? They're trying to destroy life. If you think about hospital as healing, if you think about, and what were they doing this with the guys that a hospital is a hotbed of Palestinian resistance. What a hospital is about Palestinian life and living and healing, right? And that's how I hear this, and that's how I translate this. So it's really important, I think, to sort of frame the discussion of violence, to think about that the violence and this notion of permanency are very connected. And the entity that is connected will always be connected to it's captive in its sense of violence. And that's why the violence is forever increasing, right? Criminalizing is criminalizing life. And the criminalization of resistance is something, again, resistance in all of its forms, right? I think this notion of dividing nonviolent and violent is also not our metric. It's not something that comes out from the land or of the land, right? And that's something that was also quoted in the California statement, right? They're quoting Samara Smair, that's teaching us this. And so I think it's important for us to think about, and then what Lubna was also saying about sort of the rise of the armed struggle as described in the 1968 iteration of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. That was, Yanni, that was again, it's just sort of being the historian again, that was one of many stations. And then that same organization in 1974, less than a decade later, sort of taking that notch down and not talking about the liberation of all of Palestine and talking about a 10-point plan and really changing the rhetoric of what it was, but not necessarily the guerrilla tactics that Lubna was saying is that was an entity. And just if I can, I think it's really important us, since we're zooming in, also thinking about, I think I don't want to give the Oslo years since 1993 and thereafter too much attention outside of the century, but it is important for us to stop in a Palestinian context and see how this is also echoed elsewhere. What you see happening right now in the West Bank, and particularly in the West Bank, and since 2007, this is the division internally between Palestinians under occupation, between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, is arguably one of the most formidable entities and structures of co-optation of Palestinian voices. I mean, the PA does not represent, nor has it ever claimed or wanted to represent Palestinians. It's not representative, right? It's not at all. And so one of the things that you see is that consumerism and consumerism, particularly in Ramallah, but outside of Ramallah in the West Bank, is this guise or this cover. And the PA is nothing but a co-opted entity, is nothing but a tool of settler colonial power. And it might have presented itself otherwise in the early years. But over the last 2 years, 3 years, since 2021, it is itself and the spokespeople for the PA are unadulteratedly representing a Zionist agenda in the West Bank. And so these are the contradictions, just to sort of circle back again, Mark. This is the contradiction of, what Amin was asking about is, what is the institution? Is it the people that are in the institution, or the powers from the top down that's trying to control the institution? And this, if you allow me to zoom in again, is my daily life at Bir Zayt, right? So Bir Zayt is under occupation, and it's under two different kinds of, as people often like to say, two different levels or kinds of occupation. I don't think it's two. I think it's 2 in 1. I think that the PA's pressure is nothing more than one of the many arms of the arsenal of Zionist settler colonialism in the West Bank. And so what do we do on this campus that is, on one hand, it is on both hands a living contradiction, right? It is a university in the modern colonial orientalist sense of what a university is, but it's also a place where Palestinians gather. And when we gather, we're in conversation in spite of the pressures that are around us, or because of the pressures that are around us. And we're in that conversation that Amin was talking about, where I promise you, we rarely agree. And there's a lot of different kinds of echoes in these conversations. But it's also a place where there's a potential of vitality. It's also a place where there's this potential of ongoing conversation. So if I could just share just one snippet with you. I've spoken for a while, so I'll be really quick about this. Is that, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a professor on campus, but I also host this place called the Bir Zayt University Museum. And today we had students, and it was a pedagogical experiment where there's this gallery of the museum where we're trying to transform the gallery into a space of vitality. So we bring in students, and students have courses there, right? Both within in a classroom setting, so professors come in, but also in what might be described as an open classroom. And there's a piece now, an installation now in this space that's about sort of the land and the body as occupied, and sort of thinking about what return means. And it's an installation, and the students, and it's an invitation to be interactive. And when we were in this space today, part of what we were doing was thinking about how everybody woke up to two things this morning. One, we woke up to students on campus, and how encampments happen really quickly, and thinking about how I'm sure that you understand this far better than I do, about how sort of the tactics and strategies about being able to have an encampment. And so they were moving in the space in the ways that they were not, I don't want to say mirroring, but being with students that are working on encampments in the West, on Turtle Island, which I found fascinating. And I found it really interesting, because this is this global conversation. But they were moving in pain, because this morning in Ramallah, there was a 15-year-old martyr. and a 15-year-old martyr right down the block from where I live, because the Israeli army came in with the PA security opening the doors of our fine little small city, and we didn't know what to do on campus. We didn't know if we should be on campus. I don't have any answers to these questions, and I don't pretend to have any answers to these questions. All I'm saying is that I think these are both conversations that we have in our small spaces, and they're conversations that we share in our larger, like this, in our larger conversations across these colonial boundaries and borders. And that's how Palestine, I think, it nurtures and teaches us all in that small into the large. That's how we teach each other and what getting free could possibly mean.
Thank you, Rana. Yeah, when you began talking, I immediately thought about your work on the concept of museumification and the way that that's just another level of sort of the assault on the living, and the way that, forms of sociality, gathering, a kind of criminalization of the world, right? Like this way that the indigenous world itself constantly gets put into this position of being criminalized unless it gets museumified, right? Like that becomes the kind of safe space for it to be consumable, by a settler society and settler institutions. And yeah, you're right. Like no answers. I mean, how do you respond to that situation? And I think that the kind of questions become really the important part there. So thank you. Amin, would you like to respond to this question?
I think it's more about like just putting into the room some thoughts, maybe to think about violence also, which is, so the ongoing event is violent, and it produces then a response, and then that response is criminalized or whatever. That's a mechanism, right? So it creates subjectivities in the process. So the violence produces violence, and then the violence is criminalized to legitimize further violence, while simultaneously then distinguishing that's the making of the savage in real time, that then can terrorize them and annihilate them, while simultaneously stealing their labor and land to build the conditions of oppression that then destroys the thing inside, which is the only way your settler colonialism can win, which is if people internalize that they cannot win. So then the act of response by the colonized shouldn't be policed. There isn't one way in which the colonized resists. There isn't, what shouldn't happen is for the colonized to try to police each other, which was the condition of the Oslo Accords for then the PLO to be recognized. These things are important to note, because to the extent that you stop a genocide and to the extent that you want to get free, you're faced with the same traps. In international law, based on the different things, you're either a democratic thing or you are an entity that has control over territory, right? If you're not the state within defined boundaries, blah, 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 which Israel isn't, but Israel has a whole standard onto itself. So then who's going to sign the papers that say the war is over, or the war is going on, or the people are getting money, or the people are getting sent? That has to be part of the discussion as well. Now, in terms of the violence, David Graeber talks about it. Violence, what it does is that it modifies the structures upon which imagination is thought of, right? And I think that that's really important to recognize, that the violence that's being leveled on Gaza is a violence that has to do with creating new ways of thinking, to extremes, new subjectivities, the annihilation of certain people, what's possible, what's not. But it's definitely on the path of creating something. It's just stupid people with a lot of power use brute force. And the difference between administration right now and how they treat students, they're just bureaucrats. And now they're calling the bureaucrats with guns. These are the structures of the nation state in which, to the extent that you're doing a process of getting free, we fall into the same traps. So not traps, questions. I think that to the extent that there are ways in which an institution, for example, can function, or people can do things where the inside and the outside and underneath and above and all of these things are happening, is what's already happening, right? I think the recognition of that has been difficult with people, because to the extent that there is, you know, a diversity of tactics and strategies, I think one thing that probably is clear, I don't know what decolonization means, and I don't know if that's a useful way of working with it. I know it's tradition, I identify with it, but it's about assimilation and not. I do not want to engage in struggle only to re-assimilate in the genocidal machine. I don't even think you can organize coalition around it, in fact, right? And I think that's what Palestine is showing. And now what does that look like? This zine on Land Day, Palestine is everywhere. So now you bring an aesthetic to it. Thousands of copies printed at universities. They would call it theft. We call it, that's how you sustain the struggle. But then rather than think of one place, you think of others, because it's a different way of thinking. We're stronger together than how do we see each other in struggle, and not how do we define freedom, but how do we train in the practice of freedom, right? The questions, to the extent that they remain abstract, produce some of the same pitfalls, I would say. And then I say that, you know, here's these things, but it comes with an analysis. And then here's another aesthetic, right? So this is an aesthetic from the 60s and 70s. This is a poster from the Palestinian liberation struggle for Land Day. But then it's reproduced, frame open, horizon taken, Afro-futurist type of aesthetic, where at the bottom it says in Arabic, جذورنا مغروسة في الأرض ورؤوسنا تلامس السماء وبنادقنا موجهة إلى صدور الأعداء, which is, you know, our roots are planted in the ground and our heads touch the sky and our guns are directed to the chests of our enemies. This is about, you know, it's just a different way. When you bring these things together and you collapse them as modes of thinking in a pedagogical way of doing. The other thing I'll say, maybe I wrote here, is that when a people can you know, al-hadana al-sha'biyya would be in Arabic, but to the extent that there's a revolutionary consciousness in which you have one person out of 100 that's willing to pick up a gun to defend their refugee camp, the people in the camp may not pick up the gun, but they will protect the fighter, right? That is a culture that you produce over generations of struggle, right? And this is where I want to say, it's in a way, I mean, every generation decides and they're deciding, but our strength is in our intergenerational connectivity of struggle and the different roles we can identify in the face of violence. I think one of the things that I said that got me in trouble about violence and that I refuse to denounce the violence. I have nothing to denounce. Resistance is legitimate. To the extent that you have a problem with the violence that's happening in Palestine, deal with the problem. Right? And I think that that's an important way of saying it. But what Palestinians ended up getting entrapped in is this idea of, if we police each other, if we give up certain ways of resisting, then someone will hand us freedom. Right? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that also echoes something Rana was saying about the role of policing our own, right? Your discussion about assimilation and non-assimilation is a really powerful reminder of thinking about, like, as you put it, like the kinds of questions that come up with, like, you know, how we value certain kinds of actions and how we value those actions as they operate within the moment, that there needs to be a kind of like reframing around that. I think that was beautifully put. So I actually think that, I mean, you all have given us so much. I mean, this has been such a generative discussion. I know for myself, I will be thinking about all of the things that have been said today for quite some time. And I think it beautifully connects up with all of the other discussions and actions and things that are going on right now in support of Palestinian resistance. So, but I did want to ask everyone if they would like to offer some final thoughts before we end our panel today. I don't know if anyone would like to jump in and go first.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe just a brief picking up on popular cradle notion that Amin spoke about. I think that we are in a moment where, you know, Palestine is resurrecting so many old kinds of resistance and old kinds of organizing. And I mean, I feel like the last few months being with students, I'm hearing them sing songs that like I only had seen in like archival footage from the 1960s. So there's like a resurrection of like a belief in the labor unions returning to being like, you know, at the forefront of revolutionary struggle, and a linkage between different kind of cross-racial, cross-geographic solidarity. So I'm seeing a return, but I'm also seeing a departure. Like this moment has seen every kind of person in the world try to find a creative way that they can participate in the struggle. I mean, a surfer group like reached out to the Palestinian Feminist Collective asking like how they can host a fundraiser, like a Surf for Palestine event. You know, there are actually sex workers who are putting together like organized fundraisers for Palestinian liberation. There are parents and childcare workers and mental health workers, you know, physical health care workers, labor organizers, bus drivers, you name it. I mean, profession, gifts, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. People are trying to find a way that they can contribute to this struggle. And they feel a very deep, from what I'm witnessing, a very deep relationship with the struggle as if it was their own struggle. And I think that this is really generative for this moment because it's telling us that the martyrs that are dying in Palestine, that their names and their memories are resonating with people who never met them as their own people, as their own kin in a lot of ways. I think that this is important. This is a moment that's challenging how we understand nation and nationalism, how we understand loyalty, how we understand kinship, how we understand responsibility, how we understand the status quo, how we are anchoring our action and our movement collectively in deep courage, you know, aware that the state might be cracking down on us, that we may lose our jobs, that we might actually, you know, a lot of these students know that they might face physical violence and arrest. We are seeing it yesterday in Texas and NYU, and it's not actually slowing down the movement. So I think that there's a lot on the line right now in terms of how we even understand what collective movement and organization and resistance is. And we have to be listening carefully and gleaning lessons and really thinking about how contradictions are being revealed or being engaged. And just to return to that point about the popular cradle, I don't believe in this dichotomy between armed resistance and popular resistance. I think the two operate in an ecosystem. And I think popular resistance is not one form. It's not just the protests. It's all kinds of creative, imaginatory, liberatory practices that refuse, right, the normalization of genocide. That like the thought that a genocide can be entering into its 6th month, and I'm just going to carry on with my life as if nothing is going on because it's not in my geography. I think that popular resistance is about finding things to do in the day and to feel in the day and to read in the day and to people to talk to in the day, to continue to denaturalize that for yourself emotionally and psychologically, and to denaturalize that for the community and the people that you're around. And so that's just the final thing that I would say, that we are in a moment where politics are being reimagined and being taken back by grassroots. I personally believe that that kind of work needs like organization. I'm a big Grace Lee Boggs fan, so organization means commitment. Yay. And I think that the spontaneity of it is really generative and remarkable, but I do think that there needs to be responsibility in organization around those things. So.
Thank you, Lubna. Wonderfully put. Amin, final thoughts? Oh, I think you're still on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, I was saying it was great to hear everyone's thoughts, and you know, it's an ongoing conversation. I mean, it's really important to recognize October 7th as a possibility and a call for planetary struggle that's anti-colonial, that thinks of relationships as infrastructure, that that doesn't see dichotomies either or, but and really tries to think through these categories. Part of it is like these categories are also informed by the epistemology that you're resisting. You know, that's why it's better to use words that are descriptive of what people are trying to say instead of use key terms, because the key terms are being fixed by power. Its meaning is being fixed. And I'm thinking of Stuart Hall right now. Part of the nuance of the conversations that we need to have are ones in which we actually are maybe taking a little bit more time to say what we mean and what we care about, and to create that kind of space for each other. And I think that the space of gathering is one that in itself is revolutionary if it's on the terms that we deem. This is why the encampments and deoccupations are so important. This is why the public square has been taken. This is why the Western nation states have crisis on their hands. So thinking about that helps, I think, a lot to recognize that when we are together, how do we extend it? How do we deepen it? When there are contradictions, to remember that we live in a colonized world, it isn't about purity. How do we heighten them? How do we deepen them? Yes, of course, there needs to be organizations, and there also needs to be complexity in thinking about organizations. If you need to create a space over here that's adherent to the law, and on the back end create revolutionary possibility, then you're thinking about porousness of struggle to deal with surveillance, to deal with these things. How do we get to know each other? You know, back in Palestine, when you're part of the resistance, I mean, you learn a lot about these things back in my day. But it's like الثقة لا تلغي الحذر, which in, caution, what is it? Trust doesn't eliminate caution. How can these kind of principles of struggle not be so that you're on a signal chat and no one knows that what's happening or what conversations are taking place? If you look, for example, I'll say this and end, it's like social media is both it's a problem, right? But it exists. And so how can you use it in Tahrir Square, for example? They did splinter marches that came from all sorts of places. So they decentralized how they began and they went through neighborhoods. The same tactic was used in Bay Ridge. All of these tactics from different struggles are migrating from Palestine here. And it's migrating because they forced us here. And then you're building connections. Today, what happened in Emory around Cop City? And who are the organizers there? So I think that I'd say that there's a huge attack on another type of future right now, in which Palestine is at the center, but Palestine is everywhere. And it has to be a commitment to each other that it's until we're all free and until our lands are free. Not that you negotiate away stuff in order. Now you can negotiate tactically, right? Like you can be Colombia and maybe say yes to a bunch of things and keep it for 3 more days so you can build possibility for something else to happen in the meantime, knowing not everyone agrees. So that's the final point. In these moments of revolutionary possibility, there will be difference. The important thing is to know how we move separately or together, together in agreement or separately in agreement. However, these things, it's really important to not essentialize, not overlook. It isn't just about class. It isn't just about a nation state. It's about how do we come together on our terms to create a possibility that isn't otherwise.
Thank you so much. I mean, Rana, final thoughts?
I think the final is that we're ongoing, right? There are no final thoughts, that this is an ongoing conversation amongst us and amongst a lot of other people. I think that what both Lubna and Amin brought up in terms of responsibility and crisis is really important, and putting those two together. This is not our crisis. This is a crisis of modernity that we've brought upon. And what is our responsibility towards ourselves and each other? And thinking about what is it that we want without thinking about it as a goal, but actually thinking about how we want to be in conversation with each other as we are getting free together. There's 2 things that I just kind of want to think about together with you, or at least put out there, and how we can think about this, and thinking about all the different ways that we have to deal with oppression and repression. And thinking about what Amin was just talking about tactics, and the threads that connect us and bind us, and making sure that we're always in conversation. So one of the things that I just want to highlight is that since October 9th, more than 9,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been arrested. How do we think about that? How do we think about what that means? And when we're seeing what's happening right now, we don't have a clue about what's happening inside of Israeli prisons. The only sense that we have is when we see prisoners who have been released, and they're being starved and they're being beaten, and we have at least 16 martyrs in amongst Palestinian prisoners. How do we think about that together? How do we work to sort of think about that repression and not sit with it as only an oppression? How do we think about that in terms of resistance and ongoing life? How do we think about sort of constantly working together and making sure that the conversations that we're having in different geographies that we are in are conversations that are with and amongst each other? I think that's a Palestinian challenge. And I think that's where Palestine can also teach in terms of how that's a global challenge. And the last thing I want to say is, because he's on my mind, today we celebrated his life, Walid. I just want to end with a quote from a letter that he wrote to his unborn child, who is now a child. Her name is Milad. And it's just to quote Walid and to honor his life and his mission. He wrote to his unborn child, "What do you think? Should I stop dreaming? I will continue to dream this despite the bitterness of reality. And I will search for meaning in life despite what I have lost of it. May he live in peace and power. May he rest in power." Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lubnan. Thank you, Amin and Mark, for being in conversation. Tahiyyati.
Thank you, Rana. I think that's a very powerful and appropriately troubling way to end. And I love that this ended also about a discussion about the need for ongoing conversation. I want to make sure and thank David Lloyd for organizing the series. And then also the Center for Ideas in Society, including Bianca, who's behind the scenes right now. So thank you to everyone, but most especially thank you to our panelists. This has hopefully left others with much to mull over. It has left me with quite a bit. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Mark and Ranan, Amin, David, and Bianca, and everyone for joining.
Thank you all. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.